Hello, it's Cried here, with a breakdown for the new unique skills from the Mizutsune and Zoshia items. I will also talk about Scorcher, alongside Whiteflame Torrent because while they're a bit different, they share the same triggering conditions. Let's start with the Mizutsune first. While the vast majority of the Mizutsune weapons aren't impressive at all, there is one outstanding option that even beats its Artian counterpart. I just covered the heavy bowguns, but the Mizutsune Heavy Bowgun, Mountainous Roar, is the first heavy bowgun with access to Pierce 3 and 6 shots. It might not sound like much more than Pierce 3 and 5 shots, because we don't run tetrad shots anyways, but it does wonders for Pierce ammunition's sustained damage, as Pierce ammo has a fast fire rate and a slow reload. Furthermore, Mountainous Roar also gets Ignition Mode level 2 for a stronger Wyvern Heart spam. Even though we will be completely wasting the weapon skill, Slicked Blade, and Critical Element, the additional shot and stronger Ignition Mode versus Artian Heavy Bowguns is enough to offset its slightly weaker stat spread. The test on screen is done with Pierce Jewel for the Artian Heavy Bowgun just to see how much I can push it. It barely squeezes out the win for an only Pierce ammo test. In a realistic scenario where you're using Wyvern Heart Ignition though, the winner is clear. And if I swapped Pierce Jewel over to True Shot Jewel, the Artian will lose in both Pierce damage and Wyvern Heart damage. I think this is a big win for heavy bowguns, as there are few weapon types that can actually beat a perfectly rolled Artian. Next, let's do some analysis on Slicked Blade and the Mizutsune set. Slicked Blade grants you 9% affinity when you're wet, and 21% affinity when inflicted with either minor or major bubble blight. This does stack for a total of 30% affinity when you're both wet and inflicted with bubble blight. Now, there's no reliable method to keep yourself wet over non-wet terrain, but there is a way to inflict yourself with minor bubble blight. Mizutsune's set bonus prevents major bubble blight and increases your evasion stats when you are inflicted with minor bubble blight. Unfortunately, unlike the Gore set, you need 4 pieces of the Mizutsune set to inflict yourself with minor bubble blight. And this is a big problem. If we take a look at the Mizutsune set, the headpiece has a situational utility-based skill, but it still has good decoration slots. As for the other pieces, you're basically locked into Burst 3, Constitution 3, and Evasion-based skills. For bowguns specifically, Burst 3 is barely any stronger than Burst 1, so you would be losing quite a bit of skill slots for the sake of 21% affinity. Basically, not worth it, even if you can make use of the evasion skills. The Mizutsune 4-piece requires you to dodge 3 times in order to activate Slicked Blade for 30 seconds. While this is fairly easy to do, evading solely for the sake of bubble blight is a damage loss if you want to keep high uptime for Slicked Blade. At this point, you might as well just run 2-piece Gore set with Antivirus 3. How about the other weapon types like dual blades that would utilize the burst skill and dodges better than bowguns? The problem with the other weapon types lies not with the Mizutsune set itself, but the Mizutsune weapons. They do not have the advantage of having something special like ammo distribution for heavy bowguns. In other words, their base stats are mediocre to say the least. Let's use the Mizutsune dual blades as an example. The Mizutsune set and the weapon's base affinity grants you quite a bit of crit chance, but crit chance is already easier to come by than raw attack from skills like Weakness Exploit or the Gore set. For the dual blades, you would much rather get more base attack or elemental damage. But Mizutsune's weapons have neither. Dual blades scale better to more elemental damage, and elements don't crit without critical element. Furthermore, critical element sucks for dual blades. If you need the calculations, refer to my other video in the description. So we end up in a situation where the weapons for the Mizutsune are quite bad, and probably the only good Mizutsune weapon doesn't work well with its set. So this basically turns the 4-piece Mizutsune set useless, unless you just enjoy the ultra dodges granted to you by the Bubble Blight bonus. This doesn't mean that the individual pieces of the Mizutsune set are bad though. The gloves and the greaves in particular have a base density of 9 skill points, which is both rare and high at the moment. Okay, now most of you are probably more interested in Whiteflame Torrent and Scorcher. While they share quite a bit of similarities, there are differences as well. First of all, let's talk about the damage they deal. Whiteflame Torrent on its own deals 50 true damage. This is different from Scorcher, as Scorcher deals 40 elemental damage with its 2-piece bonus, and 100 fire elemental damage with its 4-piece. These are the unbloated elemental values, so it would be the equivalent of 400 and 1000 elemental stat on your weapons. We can see this by slapping Arcveld, who has really poor elemental hit zone values. With Scorcher 4 on, we see that the damage drops drastically compared to the 30 damage you get from hitting a training dummy. On the other hand, Whiteflame Torrent remains at 50 damage. Both of these procs are not affected by the base attack, base elemental attack, and sharpness of your weapon. However, since Scorcher deals elemental damage, you can actually increase the damage of the proc by increasing your elemental damage with skills like Coalescence or Fire Attack. However, Scorcher on its own is not great, even with the added scaling, especially when it heavily depends on the target's fire hit zone values. Because of the true damage nature of Whiteflame Torrent versus the elemental damage of Scorcher that scales off the monster's elemental hit zone values, Whiteflame Torrent is indeed a lot more consistent throughout different hunts. The interesting thing is that when you combine the Zoshia weapons with Scorcher, a portion of the elemental damage bonus from Scorcher shifts to true damage, making it far more consistent, but still reliant on elemental hit zone values. Unfortunately, Zoshia's weapons have low elemental attack, which is not great for scaling elemental damage. The easiest way to scale Scorcher damage is using Fire Attack from Blaze Jewel, which will be a waste with the Zoshia weapons as they have Dragon Attack. Now onto their similarities. A big problem with Whiteflame Torrent and the Scorcher set bonus is one that they share with the skill Flare. All three of these effects fail to work on many attacks. For example, they don't work on focus strikes, sneak attacks, offset follow-ups, ammunition-based attacks, shield attacks, and many more weapon-specific attacks. Basically, within the data mined files, if the use skill additional damage column is set to false, the move should not be able to proc Whiteflame Torrent, Scorcher, nor Flare. Believe me when I say there's an entire mountain of them. The worst part is, even if some multi-hit move manages to escape the poor fate of not being able to trigger these attacks, there is also an internal cooldown of 3 seconds for triggering and re-triggering these effects. The banned moveset list and internal cooldown are big issues, as they are extremely counterintuitive. You would expect skills like Whiteflame and Scorcher to be able to proc many more times on weapons that hit more often, but in fact, the entire Blade Dance and Demon Flurry line is banned. Even for non-banned moves, there is an internal cooldown for proc checks. I do want to clarify that there is a bug or another variable that overrides use skill additional damage with the upward swing for Demon Flurry 2 on dual blades, because despite being labeled as false, this particular hit seems to sneak past the otherwise perfectly working proc system that I will explain soon. But don't depend on this move to do the heavy lifting in an entire chain. When you first hit a target, it has a 33% chance to proc Whiteflame Torrent or Scorcher. I'm not sure if Flare also works the same way, because it's a pain to test wound damage. But afterwards, it doesn't matter how many hits you do, you will no longer have any chance of proccing the skill until the 3 seconds of internal cooldown have passed. Hitting the monster with a non-banned move after 3 seconds have passed results in a 50% chance of proccing the skills if it didn't proc the first time around. This is the pity system in play. If the skills do not proc twice in a row, the third time will always proc the skill with a 100% chance. Then, it will go on its 3-second cooldown as usual. It is because of this weird cooldown period and uneven proc chance that a lot of people trying to do anecdotal counting or percent proc calculations have numbers all over the place. You might think that these numbers sound quite nonsensical, but it is actually an elegant solution for evening out the probability of events happening during each time period. This gives us an expected check of roughly 2 before an event happens. Knowing this allows me to simplify the damage calculation of Whiteflame Scorcher on my spreadsheet, which basically takes into account the time blocks and pity system as well. The assumption that you are able to hit the monster once per 3 seconds with a legal move that will proc the skill is not so realistic though. So I assumed a time period of 1 check per 5 seconds, although you'll still have to play quite well for this to happen because of all the moves that don't proc the skill and other variables in battle. And these are the expected damage per second numbers of Scorcher 2 plus Whiteflame Torrent, assuming an elemental hit zone value of 25. Now, endgame monsters like Arkfeld right now, or tempered monsters in the future, have somewhere around 22k health or so. Ignoring running time, if you kill a monster like this in 5 minutes of fighting, it means you're getting somewhere around 73 DPS. With Scorcher 2 plus Whiteflame, you're looking at these bonuses contributing about 13.6% of your total DPS, but requiring 4 pieces from the Rathalos or Guardian Rathalos set is quite limiting when you consider all the skills you actually have to give up. Unless you happen to want the skills on the Rathalos pieces, I'll tell you straight up that the 4-piece bonus really isn't that worth it. The 2-piece bonus drastically decreases your gains, which makes it just a small bonus over only running the Zoshia weapon. So let's talk about only using the Zoshia weapons for a moment, which still retains half the effectiveness of running Whiteflame Torrent plus Scorcher 2. I'm going to use the Sword and Shield Blazing Mikau as an example, because I believe Sword and Shield already favors Zoshia's weapons due to not having to deal with a bunch of restricted moves within its rotation. Furthermore, the sharpness of Zoshia weapons vary, and the Sword and Shield lucked out with 60 white sharpness. Now, if we compare this to a perfectly rolled Artian weapon, we essentially have 10 more sharpness for 5 more raw attack. The 10 points of sharpness difference is easy to make up with an overcapped handicraft gem, since the Artian has more level 3 deco slots. Assuming we get a bit more raw attack from other sources, let's just compare 255 attack to 250. The Artian weapon will essentially have 2% more damage from raw attack. However, Whiteflame Torrent is worth 6.8% damage by our calculations. Most level 3 gems are balanced around 4% to 6% damage increase, so Blazing Mikau pulls ahead here. But we should consider everything. The Zoshia weapons have a relatively low elemental damage when compared to any of its Artian counterparts, which is easily a 1% damage loss. Additionally, Whiteflame Torrent has no synergies outside of the Rathalos set. It will always consistently give you the same amount of true damage. This matters because, for example, Crit Boost 3 gives more and more damage the more affinity you have. Attack percent multipliers like Offensive Guard or even Attack Boost work multiplicatively with another attack percent multiplier, giving them more value than on their own. Having a higher base attack means that your crits will become larger too. Whiteflame procs do not enjoy the same benefit. Getting more attack can scale gunlance ammunition, while the true damage cannot. Getting a higher raw attack will allow your elemental ammo on bowguns to convert more damage into elemental, and so on. I think you get what I'm talking about. Finally, our DPS is calculated using a 22k HP monster killed in 5 minutes. What about speedrunners killing monsters under 2 minutes? Suddenly, the Whiteflame procs become much weaker now. They're literally weaker than most 3-slot decos that you will slot. Even with the time blocks changed to 4 seconds, which is honestly as low as it gets, speedrunner or not, the skill doesn't even come close to 4% effectiveness. And do remember, some weapon types just have moves that won't proc Whiteflame Torrent easily on their highest DPS combos. There's no point losing 10% DPS using a subpar combo to earn 1% to 2% more damage done from the unique skill versus a level 3 generic decoration. My overall conclusion is the following though. Scorcher 1 or 2 on its own is hot garbage unless there's a monster super weak to fire damage. But it is potentially good on specific setups with a Zoshia weapon if you're not going out of your way to fit 2 or 4 piece Rathalos on. The better you are at the game, the weaker the Zoshia weapons are for you. But for more average players, these weapons are just about tied with perfectly rolled Artian weapons, as long as your weapon type isn't filled with movesets that don't proc Whiteflame Torrent like the Gunlance. So, even for the average player, there is a lot more hoops to jump through than simply slapping on a perfectly rolled Artian. And even then, it'll work for certain setups, but nothing groundbreaking. Then again, the flip side is a perfectly rolled Artian. The Zoshia armor set, it's good. Fine-tuning and numbers will come next time. Like and subscribe so you don't miss my upcoming breakdowns. If you want to support my work, please consider buying my fantasy novel or donating to my Patreon down below. With a book purchase, you can also request a topic from me. Krite, signing out.